100 billion. This is the number of species that scientists estimate have ever existed on the planet. In fact, this is probably a low estimate. So scientists need a way to classify all of these life forms. In this slideshow, we're going to take a look at the different categories scientists use to classify living things. So the names of these categories that are used for living things are taxa. Taxa is plural and taxon is singular. And as you can see, there are several different taxa. And one difference between the different taxa is how broad each level is. At the bottom here, genus and species, these are very small categories, whereas at the top, domain and kingdoms, these are very large, broad categories. So organisms or species that belong to the same family are going to be much more similar than species that just belong to the same kingdom. Let's take a look at an example so you can better understand how this works. If we were to classify the cat species, we're going to start with the broadest categories down here. The broadest categories are domains. There's 3 domains: bacteria, eukarya, and archaea. The cat belongs to the eukarya domain. Within that domain are smaller categories known as kingdoms. The cat belongs to the Animalia, or animal kingdom. But then within the animal kingdom are smaller categories known as phylum. The cat belongs to the Chordata phylum. Within the Chordata phylum are smaller categories known as classes. The cat belongs to the Mammalia class. And so on until we get to its most specific category, its genus species, which is Felis catus. And that is actually the scientific name of a cat. You probably know most organisms by their common names, but scientists name them based on their genus and species. If you look at classification of us, you can see that one big category that we belong to is the order primates. But within that order, we belong to the family Hominidae. Within that, we belong to the genus Homo. And within that, we are the species Sapiens. So our scientific name is Homo sapiens, based on our genus and our species. So how do scientists know which category to put which species in? Well, they look at cells. They look at the number of cells and the structure of the cells. Do they have a cell wall? Do they have organelles? Do they have a nucleus? They also look at molecules within the cell. They look at their DNA, the type of carbohydrates found in the cell wall. They look at the proteins that make up them. They also take a look at nutrition. Are the organisms autotrophs, meaning they can make their own food, often through photosynthesis? Or are they heterotrophs, meaning they have to consume food in their environment? And then they also look at homologous structures, similarities in the way living things are composed. Let's turn our attention to those 3 domains of life. Remember that domains are the biggest categories for classification. And as we mentioned, the 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Both bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes. Neither domain has organisms with a nucleus. Although one important distinction between these 2 domains is that archaea have junk DNA, DNA that does not code for proteins. And that's actually similar to the domain we belong to. Scientists only discovered this recently, and in fact until a few years ago, all prokaryotes used to be lumped into a domain and kingdom known as Monera, but now we have divided that based on the presence of junk DNA into bacteria and archaea. Now, as you can see, within the eukarya domain are several smaller categories. These are the eukaryotic kingdoms. So let's take a look at some of those characteristics. Both eubacteria and archaebacteria are prokaryotic and unicellular, whereas there's some diversity within the eukaryotic domain. All of these kingdoms within the eukaryotic domain include organisms with a nucleus, but some are unicellular, some are multicellular, and some have different methods of getting their food. Here are some examples of organisms within each domain. Bacteria is a very, very diverse group. They can be heterotrophic, or cyanobacteria is photosynthetic. Archaea tends to include extremophiles. These are organisms that can live in really unpleasant areas, like very salty and very hot environments. And eukarya, as we'll come back to in a moment, includes a few different kingdoms that are actually quite different from each other. If you look closely at this, you'll see that animals are more closely related to fungus than plants. More on that in a few minutes. All right, let's take a quick look at some examples of eubacteria, the first domain to evolve. As I mentioned, there's a lot of eubacteria out there. In fact, there's more living in your mouth right now than the total number of humans that have ever lived. Kind of gross. There are also 10 times as many of these living in and on your body right now as the number of human cells in your body. So if we were to look at your cells, you'd actually be dominated by eubacteria. One common eubacteria is the heterotrophic E. coli, which can be good and bad depending on the strain. Some bacteria, though, as we mentioned, is autotrophic. Blue-green bacteria, also known as cyanobacteria, is able to do photosynthesis. Although they don't have chloroplasts, they do have chemicals like chlorophyll that allow them to capture sunlight. Archaebacteria are extremophiles. Here are some halophiles, which love salt. Here are some thermophiles, which live near hot geysers. Most organisms would die in conditions like these, but the thermophiles really like it. All right, protists. I like to think of protists as a kingdom of misfits because it's such a diverse kingdom. Essentially, things that don't fit in the prokaryotic domains, but also don't fit in the multicellular eukaryotic kingdoms, are put into the protist kingdom. But one thing that unites all of these weird organisms is that they're eukaryotic, they have a nucleus, they tend to be aquatic, found in water, some can be autotrophic and some are heterotrophic. Most are unicellular, though we'll see in a moment a few examples of multicellular protists. So first of all, how did protists get to be eukaryotic? Well, this process known as endosymbiosis explains where protists might have got some of their organelles. Way back when, there were two different bacteria. The larger bacteria engulfed the smaller bacteria, but instead of digesting it, the smaller bacteria lived inside the bigger bacteria. They both benefited. This one had a place to live and was probably supplied materials it needed. Meanwhile, this one produced energy for the larger bacteria. And as a result, over time, this bacteria became an organelle that resided within the larger cell. And that's how we explain the origin of chloroplasts and mitochondria. So very quickly, here are some examples of protists. This one is a parasite that causes sleeping sickness. This one you observed in lab. Amoebas have fake feet called pseudopods, and here you can see an amoeba in the process of phagocytosis. So this is a heterotrophic protist. Here's a specific type of amoeba that acts kind of like a vampire. It actually sucks out the cytoplasm from inside fungi. Paramecium is another heterotrophic protist, uses little cilia to move around. The malaria sickness that we've talked about in class is actually caused by a protist known as an epicomplexan, and this is carried in mosquitoes. So when a mosquito bites someone and causes malaria, it's not actually the mosquito, it's the protist that is inside the mosquito. Green algae, on the other hand, are photosynthetic. They contain chloroplasts. Some are unicellular, some are multicellular, and some just live in clumps, like this one. Diatoms are another type of photosynthetic protist. Another photosynthetic protist. Some are very good dinoflagellates because they live in coral and make food for them. Others can cause poisonous red tides. Here we see red algae, which are also photosynthetic. These are one of the few types of multicellular protists. Similarly, brown algae can be quite large, over 100 meters in length. All right, let's turn our attention to fungi. Lots of different examples of fungi, from mushrooms to mold to yeast. Let's take a look at what unites all of these different types of fungus. First of all, they're all heterotrophic. Although unlike animals who ingest and then digest their food, fungi actually secrete enzymes into the environment. The enzymes break down the food, and then the fungi are able to absorb the tiny nutrients that have been digested. Like animals, fungi are eukaryotes, but unlike animals, they have cell walls. And those cell walls are made of a carbohydrate known as chitin. So a difference between the plant and fungus cell walls are that plants have cell walls of cellulose, where fungi have cell walls of chitin. You can also see within the cells of the fungus the presence of nucleus and other organelles that make them eukaryotic. Fungi are usually multicellular. One exception is yeast, but for the most part, they're made of many cells that branch together to form mycelium. Each little branch of the mycelium is known as a hypha, and this is usually found underground, but you'll see above ground mushrooms popping up. Mushrooms are actually the reproductive part of the fungus. And the mycelium can be quite large. Many fungi are actually quite humongous. In Oregon, there's one the size of 1,600 football fields. So if you see mushrooms growing, you might want to think about what's actually underneath your feet. As I mentioned, fungi are a distant family member. We're actually, as animals, more closely related to fungi than we are to plants. And part of the reason is our nutrition. We're both heterotrophs. However, we're not that closely related to fungi. We did diverge from our common ancestor about 1.5 billion years ago. Fungi can reproduce sexually and asexually. The spores that you might see coming from bread mold is part of their asexual reproduction, but the hyphae can also join together to reproduce sexually. Now, fungi tend to get a bad rap, and some of it is deserved. Some fungus will cause diseases, such as the Dutch elm disease that's destroyed many trees in America. Then again, we have yeast, the unicellular fungus that's responsible for bread and some alcoholic beverages. This one, not so good. Corn smut gets around, grows on corn. Then again, if you like blue cheese, you can thank fungus for its flavor. Hopefully you've never experienced this, but if you have, you can blame it on a fungus. We do owe fungus thanks for certain medicines, such as penicillin. This antibiotic is actually extracted from a mold. And one of the most important roles that fungi play for us is that they are decomposers. You probably noticed that dead things, roadkill, doesn't last very long on the side of the road. Well, one reason is that fungi and bacteria will break down dead organisms and recycle their nutrients for the environment. And some fungi actually live with algae together in a symbiotic relationship. If you've ever seen lichen growing on the ground, the lichen is actually composed of two different species, a fungus and an algae, and they both help each other out in terms of nutrition. Finally, we have some leaves or some ants that actually farm fungi. They grow little fields of fungus, they harvest it, they fertilize it, they weed it, and the fungus actually has a good environment to grow in because of these ants, and meanwhile the ants get a lot of their nutrition from the fungus. All right, so that concludes our whirlwind survey of the different domains and kingdoms of life.